3 widows, 3 weeks, 3 deaths. The afternoon sun filtered through the ancient oaks of Meadowbrook Manor with that peculiar golden quality that only English summer could provide. It was the sort of day, Miss Jane Marple reflected, as she adjusted her wide-brimmed hat, that made one forget entirely the existence of January and February. The annual Meadowbrook Garden Party had been a fixture of St. Mary Mead's social calendar for 40 years, and this year promised to be no different from any other. A promise that would prove spectacularly false before the cucumber sandwiches had been properly digested. "More tea, Miss Marple?" Mrs. Dolly Bantry, her dear friend and hostess, appeared at her elbow with the teapot, her face flushed with the pleasure of successful hostessing. "You must try the lemon cake. Mrs. Pemberton brought it, and I must say, it's the first decent thing I've seen her produce in years." Miss Marple accepted both tea and cake with her customary grace, her eyes deceptively mild behind their steel-rimmed spectacles, taking in the assembled company with the attention of a naturalist observing a particularly interesting colony of insects. And indeed, she often thought, the comparison was not entirely inappropriate. Human nature, in her considerable experience, followed patterns as predictable as any creature in God's kingdom. The garden party had drawn out what passed for society in their small village and its environs. Colonel Weatherby, red-faced and pontificating near the rose arbour about what ought to be done with the Germans, though the war had been over for more than a decade. The Mrs. Skinner, the twin spinsters who ran the village post office with an efficiency that bordered on the militant, sat together on a wrought iron bench, their heads tilted toward each other in permanent conspiracy. Young Dr. Haydock moved through the crowd with professional bonhomie, pausing to check on elderly Mrs. Price, who claimed a different ailment with each passing week. But Miss Marple's attention, though she would have been at pains to deny any particular interest, kept returning to a cluster of 3 women seated beneath the elm tree at the garden's far edge. The 3 widows, as the village had taken to calling them, though never quite in their hearing. Mrs. Cynthia Ashford sat with military straightness in her chair, her black dress severe despite the sunshine, her iron-grey hair pulled back with uncompromising firmness, which she had been widowed 3 years prior, when her husband, a wealthy industrialist 20 years her senior, had succumbed to a heart condition. Her expression suggested she found the garden party frivolous, but had attended from a sense of social obligation that could not be shirked. Beside her, in deliberate contrast, Mrs. Vera Thornhill arranged herself with the studied grace of a woman who had once been beautiful and had not yet entirely reconciled herself to the past tense. Her widow's weeds were cut with fashionable flair, and she wore them with the air of a costume rather than genuine mourning. Her husband had died 18 months ago in a motoring accident on the London road, driving too fast, as he had apparently done everything in life. The whispers in the village suggested the marriage had been stormy, though Mrs. Thornhill's face revealed nothing beyond practiced serenity. The 3rd widow, Mrs. Eleanor Bingham, seemed almost apologetic for her presence, as though widowhood were a social solecism she had committed inadvertently. She was younger than her companions, not yet 40, and possessed a faded prettiness that suggested a flower pressed too long between the pages of a book. Her husband had died just 6 months ago, quite suddenly, of what Dr. Haydock had called acute gastric distress. She twisted a handkerchief between her fingers as she listened to Mrs. Ashford's pronouncements with evident anxiety. Most peculiar, murmured Miss Marple to Mrs. Bantry. How they've become such fast friends. One wouldn't have thought they had much in common. Mrs. Bantry followed her gaze. Oh, but they do, dear. They're all on the board of the St. Mary Mead Widows Benevolent Fund. You know, the charity that provides assistance to less fortunate widows in the district. Mrs. Ashford founded it after her husband died, and the others joined shortly after their own bereavements. They meet every Tuesday at Mrs. Ashford's house. Quite devoted to the cause, I understand. How very charitable, Miss Marple said softly. And something in her tone made Mrs. Bantry glance at her sharply. But the old lady's face revealed nothing beyond polite interest. At that moment, a general stir ran through the party. Mrs. Bantry's maid, Lorimer, had emerged from the house, moving with uncharacteristic haste, her face pale. She made directly for her mistress, bending to whisper urgently in her ear. Mrs. Bantry's teacup rattled against its saucer. Good heavens, are you quite certain? Every head turned. Conversations died like candles in a draught. Even Colonel Weatherby's lecture on the German problem stuttered to an undignified halt. Mrs. Bantry rose, her face grave. I'm afraid I must ask everyone to remain calm. Lorimer has just discovered. She paused, clearly struggling with how to frame the news. Mrs. Pemberton has been found in the conservatory. She appears to be, that is, Dr. Haydock, if you would be so kind. But Dr. Haydock was already striding toward the house, his medical bag miraculously at hand. Miss Marple noticed, because she noticed everything, that the three widows beneath the elm tree had frozen in identical attitudes of shock. Mrs. Ashford rigid, Mrs. Thornhill pale, and Mrs. Bingham pressing that tortured handkerchief to her lips. The doctor returned within 10 minutes, his face professionally composed but serious. I'm afraid Mrs. Pemberton is dead. It appears to be her heart, though of course there will need to be a proper examination. Mrs. Bantry, perhaps we might telephone for the police. A heart attack at a garden party was tragic, but hardly mysterious. These things happened, particularly to women of a certain age, who would insist on rich foods and tight corsets. The party began to break up in clusters of excited, horrified conversation. But Miss Marple, accepting Mrs. Bantry's arm as they made their way toward the house, had observed one small detail that troubled her. Mrs. Pemberton had been drinking tea, and beside her cup, barely visible unless one looked carefully, was the faint residue of what might have been powder that hadn't quite dissolved. Dear me, she murmured, so quietly that even Mrs. Bantry didn't hear. How very interesting. By the following morning, the death of Mrs. Pemberton had become the sole topic of conversation in St. Mary Mead, discussed with the thoroughness and relish that only a small English village can bring to such matters. The postmistress, Mrs. Skinner, had been instrumental in disseminating the news, naturally, as every soul in the village passed through their establishment at some point during the day, and the sisters had elevated information sharing to an art form that would have impressed the intelligence service. Miss Marple, making her customary morning rounds to the butcher and greengrocer, found herself the object of considerable attention, having been present at the fateful event. She deflected questions with her usual gentle vagueness, expressing appropriate shock and sadness, while her sharp eyes observed the various reactions of her fellow villagers. Such a tragedy, declared Mrs. Price at the chemist's, leaning heavily on her walking stick, though I must say, Martha Pemberton never took proper care of herself. I warned her only last month about her blood pressure, but would she listen? No, indeed, always rushing about with her committees and her good works. Miss Marple made a soft sound of agreement, but her mind was elsewhere. Mrs. Pemberton had indeed been a woman of robust constitution, always first to volunteer for church bazaars and charity drives. A heart attack seemed incongruous with such vigour, though of course these things happened. Still, there was that matter of the powder residue. At the grocer's, she encountered young Dr. Haydock, who was purchasing cigarettes with an air of distraction. "Good morning, Doctor," Miss Marple ventured. "Such a dreadful business yesterday. I do hope the examination proved straightforward." Dr. Haydock's expression clouded. "Well, Miss Marple, that's the peculiar thing. I've sent samples to the pathologist at the county hospital. Mrs. Pemberton did have a heart condition. I'd been treating her for angina these past months, though she kept it quite private. But there were certain inconsistencies that warrant further investigation." "Inconsistencies?" Miss Marple's tone remained mild, but her attention sharpened. Her symptoms weren't quite typical for a simple cardiac episode. The rapidity of onset, certain signs— He stopped himself, shaking his head. "But I shouldn't be discussing a patient's case, even post-mortem. Forgive me. Is Miss Marple? The shock of it has rather unsettled my professional discretion." As he departed, Miss Marple stood quite still, her shopping basket on her arm, thinking. Then she made her way to the vicarage, where she knew she would find both a sympathetic ear and access to the full spectrum of village opinion. For the vicar's wife, Griselda, had her finger firmly on the pulse of St. Mary Mead's collective consciousness. She found Griselda in the garden, attempting to prevent her two young sons from destroying the herbaceous borders, in their enthusiasm for what appeared to be a game involving pirates and buried treasure. "Miss Marple," Griselda cried with evident relief, "thank heavens! Perhaps the children will behave with a guest present. Boys, say good morning to Miss Marple properly, and then go play on the lawn. The lawn, David, not the vegetable patch." Once settled with tea in the morning room, Griselda leaned forward conspiratorially. "It's all anyone can talk about, poor Mrs. Pemberton. Though I must confess, I'm rather surprised it was her heart. She always seemed so terribly healthy, marching about organizing everyone. I'd have thought she'd live to be 90, making us all feel inadequate with her efficiency." "Had she any enemies?" Miss Marple inquired with apparent innocence, selecting a biscuit from the offered plate. Griselda blinked. "Enemies? Miss Marple, surely you don't think, but the doctor said her heart." Of course. I merely wondered about her social connections. One likes to understand these things. Well?" Griselda settled back, warming to her subject. "She wasn't universally beloved, if I'm honest. Terribly managing, you know. Were always insisting things be done her way. She and Mrs. Ashford had a frightful row last year over the Widow's Benevolent Fund. Something about Mrs. Pemberton questioning the accounts. And she'd recently blocked Mrs. Thornhill's application to the board, said something about unsuitability, though no one knows quite what she meant by it. Mrs. Bingham was the only one who seemed genuinely fond of her. But then Mrs. Bingham is fond of everyone. She hasn't the spine to dislike anyone properly." Miss Marple absorbed this information like a sponge, though her expression remained merely politely interested. The three widows seem quite devoted to their charity work. "Oh, devoted isn't the word. They meet every Tuesday without fail. Closed meetings too, which some think rather odd. My sister-in-law applied for assistance when she was widowed last year, and they turned her down flat. Said the funds were allocated to more pressing cases, whatever that means. Between you and me, I think Mrs. Ashford runs it like her own private kingdom." At that moment, the vicar himself entered. his gentle face troubled. "Ah, Miss Marple, I'm glad you're here. I've just come from the police station. Inspector Slack is coming down from the county office. Dr. Haydock's preliminary findings have raised questions about Mrs. Pemberton's death. They're treating it as, well, as potentially suspicious." The room fell silent. Even the sounds of the boys playing outside seemed suddenly distant. "Suspicious?" Griselda breathed. "You mean poison?" "We mustn't jump to conclusions," the vicar said hastily, as though his expression suggested his own conclusions had already jumped quite far. "But there will be inquiries. Statements will need to be taken from everyone present at the garden party." Miss Marple set down her teacup with a gentle click. "Dear me," she said softly, "how very disturbing. And at dear Mrs. Bantry's party too. She must be quite distraught." But her mind was already sifting through yesterday's observations. Mrs. Pemberton with her tea, the three widows frozen beneath the elm tree, their faces white with shock, or was it fear? And that powder, barely visible, beside the cup. Murder, she thought, had come to St. Mary Mead once again. And if her instincts were correct, and they very seldom proved otherwise, this was merely the beginning. Inspector Slack arrived in St. Mary Mead with the air of a man who had seen too many village murders, and had developed a philosophy about them. They were inevitably committed by the most obvious suspect, and his job was to arrest that person as expeditiously as possible, preferably before lunch. He was a large, florid man with a tendency toward impatience and a profound skepticism regarding elderly ladies who fancied themselves detectives. Miss Marple, having learned of his arrival through the efficient intelligence network that was the Mrs. Skinner, made her way to Mrs. Bantry's house that afternoon, ostensibly to offer comfort to her friend, but actually to observe the inspector's methods. She found Mrs. Bantry in the morning room, looking distinctly harassed. "Jane, thank goodness you've come. And that dreadful Inspector Slack has been tramping about asking the most impertinent questions. As if I would poison someone at my own garden party. The very suggestion is monstrous." "I'm quite certain he suspects no such thing, dear," Miss Marple soothed, though privately she thought Inspector Slack perfectly capable of suspecting anyone of anything if it suited his convenience. "Has he determined how the poison was administered? Assuming, of course, that it was poison." "Digitalis," Mrs. Bantry said grimly. "Dr. Haydock confirmed it this morning. A massive dose, apparently, mixed into her tea. The inspector has already interviewed all the servants and is now insisting on speaking with every guest individually. He's set himself up in Arthur's study like some sort of magistrate." Miss Marple's needles, she had brought her knitting, as always, clicked steadily. "Digitalis? How interesting. That comes from foxglove, does it not? Such a common garden plant." "Common? My dear Jane, half the gardens in England have foxglove. The inspector seems to think that narrows things down, but I can name a dozen people at the party who have it growing in their borders." At that moment, the study door opened and Mrs. Eleanor Bingham emerged, her face blotched with tears, twisting that eternal handkerchief between her fingers. She started at seeing Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry, then attempted a tremulous smile. "Mrs. Bantry, I do apologize for all this trouble. If only I hadn't suggested that Martha join the fund committee. But she was so insistent, and I thought, well, 3 widows are better than 2. And she did have considerable organizational experience." She broke off, dabbing at her eyes. "My dear Mrs. Bingham," Mrs. Bantry said with genuine sympathy, "none of this is your fault. Do sit down for a moment and compose yourself before you leave." But Mrs. Bingham shook her head frantically. No, I must get home. The inspector's questions, they were so pointed, so suspicious, as if any of us would have wanted Martha dead. It's unconscionable." She fled toward the front door with almost unseemly haste. Miss Marple's needles had paused. "She seems quite distressed." "Well, naturally, we're all distressed." "Oh, here comes Mrs. Thornhill. Perhaps she'll have more composure." Mrs. Vera Thornhill did indeed present a more controlled appearance, though Miss Marple's observant eyes detected a certain rigidity in her bearing that suggested control maintained with difficulty. She nodded to Mrs. Bantry with cool civility and acknowledged Miss Marple with a tight smile. "What an ordeal," she said, her voice carefully modulated. "The inspector seems determined to find something sinister in perfectly innocent circumstances. He was most interested in the fact that I'd spoken with Martha shortly before it happened, as if conversation was somehow incriminating." "What did you speak about?" Miss Marple asked with gentle curiosity. Mrs. Thornhill's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Nothing of consequence. Fund business. Martha had some rather accusatory questions about certain expenditures. She had a regrettable tendency to question everyone's integrity." A pause, then more carefully. "I don't mean to speak ill of the dead, of course." "Of course not, dear," murmured Miss Marple, her needles resuming their steady rhythm. After Mrs. Thornhill's departure, Mrs. Ashford emerged from the study with the bearing of a general leaving a battlefield. Her expression was thunderous. "That man," she announced without preamble, "is an incompetent fool. He has already decided that one of the fund committee members is responsible, simply because Martha died at a charity event where we were all present. Guilt by association, apparently, is now sufficient for modern police work." "Surely the inspector must follow every line of inquiry," Miss Marple suggested mildly. Mrs. Ashford's cold eyes fixed on her. "Miss Marple, I had not realized you were here. Yes, well, inquiries are all very well, but the man seems incapable of understanding basic charitable operations. He's demanding to see our financial records, as if the Widow's Benevolent Fund has anything to do with Martha's death." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her tone as soft as silk. "Mrs. Pemberton discovered some irregularity. I understand she had raised questions about the accounts." The temperature in the room dropped several degrees. Mrs. Ashford drew herself up to her full, considerable height. "Mrs. Pemberton raised questions about everything. It was her nature to be suspicious and interfering. If there were irregularities, which there most certainly were not, she would have been the cause of them through her constant meddling. Now, if you'll excuse me, Mrs. Bantry, I have matters to attend to." She swept out with magnificent indignation, leaving a charged silence in her wake. "Goodness," breathed Mrs. Bantry, "I've never seen her quite so agitated. But though she does have a point about Inspector Slack, he does seem rather fixated on the widows." Miss Marple's needles clicked thoughtfully. "Perhaps because the inspector, for all his faults, recognizes that murder is usually a matter of proximity and opportunity. Mrs. Pemberton died drinking tea at a public event. The poison must have been administered by someone close enough to access her cup without drawing attention. That rather limits the field, doesn't it? But any of the servants could they? In full view of 40 guests? I think not, dear. No, whoever did this was someone whose presence near Mrs. Pemberton would occasion no remark. Someone she trusted enough to accept refreshment from their hands." Mrs. Bantry stared at her friend with dawning comprehension. "Jane, you think it was one of the three widows?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, setting down her knitting, "that Inspector Slack may be incompetent in many respects, but his instincts about proximity are quite sound. and I think there are questions about that charitable fund that want answering. Mrs. Pemberton questioned the accounts, and now Mrs. Pemberton is dead. That may be coincidence, of course. But you don't believe in coincidence. No, dear, said Miss Marple gently. I really don't. By the following morning, Inspector Slack had made his decision with the decisive certainty of a man who believed in simple solutions. Miss Marple learned of it while purchasing stamps at the post office, where the Mrs. Skinner were practically vibrating with the importance of their information. Arrested! Miss Lavinia Skinner announced in a stage whisper that carried to every corner of the small shop. Mrs. Cynthia Ashford, taken into custody not an hour ago. On what grounds? Inquired Miss Marple, counting out her coins with careful precision. Miss Julia Skinner leaned across the counter, her eyes gleaming. Financial fraud and murder, if you please. Inspector Slack discovered that Mrs. Ashford has been embezzling from the Widow's Benevolent Fund for more than 2 years. Thousands of pounds, they say. And Mrs. Pemberton had discovered the theft and threatened to expose her. Motive, means, and opportunity. The inspector was quite proud of himself when he explained it to Constable Pock. Miss Marple accepted her stamps with a thoughtful expression. How very convenient. And the means? Has the inspector established how Mrs. Ashford supposedly administered the poison? The sisters exchanged glances. Well, Miss Lavinia said, slightly deflated, that part isn't entirely clear. But she was at the garden party, and she does grow foxglove in her garden. Constable Polk confirmed it himself. And she had argued with Mrs. Pemberton repeatedly about the fund accounts. I see, said Miss Marple softly. Thank you, ladies. Most illuminating. She made her way to the vicarage, where she found Griselda in a state of agitation, the morning newspaper spread before her on the breakfast table. Have you seen this, Miss Marple? They've arrested Mrs. Ashford. It's right here in the county paper. Prominent widow charged with embezzlement and murder. The vicar is terribly upset. He says we mustn't rush to judgment, but honestly, it does seem rather conclusive, doesn't it? He's stealing from widows, her own charity. It's monstrous. Miss Marple seated herself and accepted the cup of tea Griselda poured with shaking hands. Tell me, my dear, what do you know of Mrs. Ashford's financial circumstances? Griselda blinked at the question. Her circumstances? Well, she's quite wealthy, I suppose. Her late husband left her very comfortably situated. A large house, investments, that sort of thing. Why do you ask? Because, Miss Marple said, stirring her tea with delicate precision, it seems curious that a wealthy woman would need to embezzle from a charity. Of course, people do develop expensive habits. Gambling, perhaps, or some other vice that requires constant funds. Did Mrs. Ashford display any such tendencies? Mrs. Ashford? Good heavens, no! She's the most parsimonious woman I've ever encountered. She wouldn't spend twopence if she could avoid it. Her clothes are decades old, and she's always complaining about the cost of everything. The vicar says she questioned every penny spent on church flowers. How very interesting. Miss Marple sipped her tea. A wealthy, parsimonious woman stealing from a charity she herself founded. It doesn't quite fit, does it? But the inspector found evidence, bank records apparently. Money transferred to Mrs. Ashford's personal account from the fund. Yes, Miss Marple murmured. How very straightforward. Almost too straightforward, one might say. At that moment, the vicar entered, looking more troubled than Miss Marple had seen him in some time. Miss Marple, I'm glad you're here. I've just come from visiting Mrs. Ashford at the police station. She's been permitted visitors, although Inspector Slack made it clear He considers it a waste of time. She maintains her complete innocence. And do you believe her? Miss Marple asked directly. The vicar sank into a chair, running his hand through his thinning hair. I want to believe her. She was most emphatic that she knew nothing of any embezzlement, that the fund accounts were entirely proper when last she reviewed them. She seems genuinely bewildered by the evidence against her. When did she last review the accounts? That's the peculiar thing. She says she reviewed them thoroughly just last week, after Mrs. Pemberton's accusations. She found everything in perfect order and told Mrs. Pemberton as much. Yet now the police have discovered systematic theft dating back 2 years. Miss Marple's needles emerged from her bag and began their steady work. Yeah, how are the fund's finances managed? Who has access to the accounts? All 3 committee members, I believe. Mrs. Ashford as founder and chairman, Mrs. Thornhill as treasurer, and Mrs. Bingham as secretary. They all have signing authority at the bank. How very democratic, Miss Marple observed, and how very convenient for someone wishing to commit fraud while implicating another. Griselda gasped. You think Mrs. Ashford is innocent? That someone framed her? I think, Miss Marple said carefully, that Inspector Slack has found exactly what someone wanted him to find. A clear suspect with apparent motive, means and opportunity. It's all very neat. Too neat, perhaps. The vicar leaned forward. But who would do such a thing? And why murder Mrs. Pemberton? Those, said Miss Marple, are indeed the pertinent questions. Let us consider what we know. Mrs. Pemberton questioned the fund accounts and was murdered. Mrs. Ashford is arrested for embezzlement and murder based on evidence that appears quite suddenly and conveniently. Meanwhile, Mrs. Thornhill and Mrs. Bingham remain free, both of them with equal access to the fund's finances. You suspect one of them? The vicar looked troubled. Mrs. Bingham seems so gentle, so harmless. And Mrs. Thornhill, while perhaps somewhat cold, hardly seems the murdering type. Miss Marple smiled gently. My dear vicar, in my experience, there is no murdering type. I have known the gentlest souls commit terrible acts when sufficiently motivated. And as for Mrs. Bingham's harmlessness, she paused, her needles clicking. I'm reminded of a kitchen maid we once had in my youth. Such a sweet, timid creature. Always apologizing, always nervous. It turned out she had been systematically poisoning the cook who bullied her. Small doses over months, until the poor woman's constitution was quite destroyed. The maid wept copiously at the funeral. Griselda shuddered. That's horrible. Yes, dear. Human nature so often is. The question before us is not who seems capable of murder, but who had the strongest reason to commit it. Mrs. Pemberton discovered something, I'm quite certain of that. Whether it was embezzlement or some other secret, she threatened someone's security or reputation. That someone killed her and has now arranged for Mrs. Ashford to take the blame. But Inspector Slack seems entirely satisfied with his arrest, the vicar protested. Yes, said Miss Marple, gathering her knitting, which means, I'm afraid, that the real murderer is still quite free and possibly quite pleased with themselves. And that, my dears, is a very dangerous situation indeed. Because you see, if they've killed once to protect their secret, they may well kill again. The words hung in the morning air like a chill premonition, and neither the vicar nor his wife could find anything reassuring to say in response. Miss Marple spent the remainder of that day in quiet contemplation, her mind turning over the puzzle pieces like a patient gardener examining seeds. There was something she had observed at the garden party, something small, easily overlooked, that nagged at the edges of her consciousness like a forgotten name on the tip of one's tongue. That evening, she called upon Mrs. Bantry once more, finding her friend in much better spirits now that the immediate drama had shifted away from her household. "The whole thing has been quite dreadful, Jane, but at least it's resolved now. Arthur says I mustn't dwell on it. Having a murder at one's garden party is unfortunate, but having the murderess arrested is the best possible outcome." Miss Marple settled into her favourite chair, her knitting bag on her lap. "I wonder, dear, if I might impose upon you to recall the exact sequence of events on the afternoon of the party, specifically the half-hour before Mrs. Pemberton's death." Mrs. Bantry looked surprised, but obliged willingly enough. She had, after all, lived through enough of Miss Marple's investigations to know that such requests were never idle curiosity. "Well, let me think. And the party was in full swing. People scattered about the garden in their usual groups. I was circulating, as a hostess must. Mrs. Pemberton arrived rather late, I recall, perhaps 3 o'clock. She made apologies about being delayed by some committee matter. She seemed somewhat agitated. Did she speak with anyone in particular? Let me see. She went directly to the 3 widows. Well, the other 2 widows, as we must now think of them. They were seated beneath the elm tree, as I mentioned before. There was quite an intense conversation, I noticed, though I couldn't hear what was said. Mrs. Ashford looked distinctly displeased. After perhaps 10 minutes, Mrs. Pemberton left them and came toward the refreshment table. Alone? Yes, quite alone. She served herself tea from the urn and took several sandwiches, and then she moved to one of the small tables near the conservatory, rather isolated actually. I thought it odd at the time, as Mrs. Pemberton usually thrived in company. She seemed to be waiting for someone. Miss Marple's needles paused. Waiting? What gave you that impression? She kept glancing toward the house, as if expecting someone to join her, and she didn't eat her sandwiches, which was unlike her. She had a healthy appetite. She simply sat there, drinking her tea and watching. It couldn't have been more than 10 or 15 minutes before Lorimer found her collapsed. Did anyone approach her during those minutes? Mrs. Bantry frowned in concentration. I was attending to Colonel Weatherby. He was complaining about the strength of the tea, naturally, so I wasn't paying particular attention. But I think, yes, I'm almost certain Mrs. Bingham went over to her briefly. I remember noticing because Mrs. Bingham seemed flustered, as she always does, and she returned to the elm tree almost immediately. Mrs. Bingham, Miss Marple repeated softly. Not Mrs. Ashford or Mrs. Thornhill. No, definitely Mrs. Bingham. The other 2 remained under the tree the entire time. I'm quite sure of it, because Mrs. Ashford's black dress was so distinctive, and Mrs. Thornhill was wearing that rather elaborate hat. One couldn't miss her. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, but her mind was racing. Tell me, did you notice what Mrs. Bingham was carrying when she approached Mrs. Pemberton? Carrying? Mrs. Bantry's brow furrowed. I don't think, wait. Yes, she had a small handbag. One of those beaded things that hardly hold anything. She was clutching it rather tightly. I remember thinking how nervous she looked. And did she still have it when she returned to the others? Mrs. Bantry stared at her friend. Jane, what are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything, dear. I'm merely trying to establish facts. Did she? I don't recall. Good heavens, you don't think timid little Mrs. Bingham could have poisoned Martha Pemberton? That's absurd. She hasn't the nerve to swat a fly. Miss Marple smiled her gentle, knowing smile. In my experience, Those who appear most timid often possess surprising reserves of determination when threatened. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Tell me, what do you know of Mrs. Bingham's late husband? Harold Bingham? Not much, I'm afraid. They kept rather to themselves. He was some sort of businessman, imports, I think, or possibly exports. They only moved to Sunnot, Mary Mead, about 3 years ago. He died last autumn, as I mentioned. Very sudden, very sad. Mrs. Bingham was quite devastated. Dr. Haydock attended him? I believe so. Yes, I'm certain he did. Why do you ask? But Miss Marple was already rising, gathering her belongings with purpose. I wonder, dear, if you would excuse me. There's something I need to verify. Would you be so kind as to telephone Dr. Haydock and ask if he might spare me a few minutes this evening? Tell him it's rather important. Mrs. Bantry looked bewildered, but reached for the telephone. Of course, but Jane, what on earth? Just a small matter I need to clarify, Miss Marple said, already moving toward the door. A detail that's been troubling me. You know how I am about details, dear. They do so pile up if one doesn't attend to them properly. An hour later, Miss Marple sat in Dr. Haydock's comfortable study. Accepting a glass of sherry she had no intention of drinking. The doctor regarded her with a mixture of affection and wariness. He had learned to respect her seemingly innocent inquiries. Mrs. Bantry said you had questions about Mrs. Pemberton's death, he prompted. Not precisely, Miss Marple said. Actually, I'm curious about Harold Bingham's death last autumn. You attended him, I believe. Dr. Haydock's expression grew guarded. I did. It was acute gastric distress, as I indicated at the time. Very severe, very rapid. He was dead within hours of the onset of symptoms. Did you suspect anything irregular? The doctor was silent for a long moment. Miss Marple, I'm not certain what you're implying. I'm implying nothing, doctor. I'm asking directly. Did Harold Bingham's symptoms suggest poisoning? Another silence, longer this time. Finally, Dr. Haydock sighed. They were consistent with severe food poisoning. I had no reason at the time to suspect foul play. His wife was distraught, and there had been a dinner party the evening before. Several guests complained of mild stomach upset. It seemed a tragic case of contaminated food. But now, with Mrs. Pemberton's murder, now, the doctor interrupted heavily, I'm wondering if I missed something. The symptoms could have been consistent with certain poisons if one were looking for such a thing. But why would anyone poison Harold Bingham? And what connection could there possibly be to Martha Pemberton's death 6 months later? Miss Marple set down her untouched sherry with deliberate care. That, doctor, is precisely what I intend to discover. Tell me, who else was at that dinner party? Let me think, it was a small gathering. The Binghams were not extensive entertainers. Mrs. Ashford was there, I recall, and Mrs. Thornhill, and Martha Pemberton. The clock on the mantel ticked loudly in the sudden silence. I see, said Miss Marple very quietly. How very, very interesting indeed. The revelation about Harold Bingham's dinner party occupied Miss Marple's thoughts through a largely sleepless night. By morning, she had formulated a plan of action that required delicacy, discretion, and perhaps a touch of what the younger generation might call calculated deception. She began by paying a call on Mrs. Eleanor Bingham. Arriving at the modest cottage on Church Lane, with a basket of raspberry preserves and an expression of sympathetic concern, Mrs. Bingham answered the door looking even more fragile than usual, her eyes red-rimmed, her hands trembling as she admitted her visitor. Miss Marple, how kind of you to call. I'm afraid I'm not receiving visitors properly. The house is in such disorder, and I've been quite unable to manage anything since this dreadful business with Mrs. Ashford. to think that Cynthia could have done such terrible things. And Martha, poor dear Martha. There, Miss Marple soothed, following her into a sitting room that was, contrary to her protestations, immaculately ordered. These are difficult times for everyone. I thought perhaps you might appreciate some company. One does feel so isolated in moments of crisis. Mrs. Bingham dabbed at her eyes with her omnipresent handkerchief. You're very kind. I confess, I've been quite alone since the arrest. Vera, Mrs. Thornhill, seems to be avoiding everyone. I telephoned her yesterday, but she claimed a headache and couldn't see me. After all we've been through together with the fund, I thought we were friends, but perhaps I was mistaken. Miss Marple settled herself comfortably, her knitting emerging as if by magic. The Widow's Benevolent Fund must have been a great comfort to you after your husband's passing. Such a terrible loss, and so sudden. A spasm of something, pain, fear, crossed Mrs. Bingham's face. Yes, Harold's death was quite devastating. I still cannot think of it without. She broke off, pressing the handkerchief to her lips. Dr. Haydock mentioned there was a dinner party the evening before he fell ill. Miss Marple ventured gently. How distressing that must have been. He's with guests in the house. Mrs. Bingham's eyes widened slightly. Dr. Haydock told you about the dinner. I'm surprised he remembered. It was such an insignificant little gathering. Just a few acquaintances. Harold thought it might cheer me to have company. I'd been rather low, you see, feeling unappreciated, and she stopped abruptly, as if realizing she'd said too much. Unappreciated? Miss Marple prompted with gentle curiosity. It's nothing. Simply that Harold could be rather demanding. He expected things done just so, and I'm afraid I'm not terribly efficient. Not like Martha, who managed everything so beautifully. She was always telling me I needed more backbone, more organization. Mrs. Bingham's voice had taken on an edge that was quite unlike her usual timid tone. Martha had very decided opinions about how everyone should conduct themselves. She questioned the fund accounts, I understand. Mrs. Bingham's teacup rattled in its saucer. Yes, she was quite insistent that something was amiss. Of course, now we know she was right. Cynthia had been stealing all along. But at the time, I thought Martha was simply being difficult. She could be very difficult when she chose. Did she discuss her suspicions with you specifically? There was a definite pause before Mrs. Bingham answered. She mentioned them to all of us. She said the numbers didn't align properly, that money was being diverted. Cynthia was furious, absolutely livid. I'd never seen her so angry. And Vera was defensive, saying Martha had no right to make accusations without proof. It was all most unpleasant. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. But you, as secretary, would have access to all the records as well, would you not? Mrs. Bingham's hands clenched in her lap. I suppose so, yes. But I'm hopeless with figures. Everyone knows that. I simply filed papers and took notes at meetings. Vera handled all the financial transactions as treasurer, and Cynthia reviewed everything. I was just there to make up the numbers, really. How modest of you, Miss Marple murmured. Tell me, my dear, what did your late husband do precisely? Mrs. Bantry mentioned imports or exports. The change of subject seemed to unsettle Mrs. Bingham rather than relieve her. Harold dealt in pharmaceutical supplies. He had connections on the continent, Switzerland primarily. It was all rather technical. I never understood the details of his business. Pharmaceutical supplies, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. How interesting! Would that have included medicinal compounds? Digitalis, for instance? The colour drained entirely from Mrs. Bingham's face. I don't know. Perhaps. Why do you ask? Mere curiosity, dear. At my age, one develops an unfortunate interest in medicinal matters. Miss Marple smiled benignly. Your husband must have left you comfortably situated. The pharmaceutical trade can be quite lucrative. Harold left debts, Mrs. Bingham said flatly, her voice suddenly stripped of its usual tremulous quality. Considerable debts. The business was failing. Had been for years, apparently, though he never told me. When he died, I discovered I was nearly destitute. But that's why I joined the Widow's Benevolent Fund. I thought I might qualify for assistance myself. But Cynthia said I didn't meet the criteria. Too much pride to admit I needed help, she claimed, though how she determined that I cannot imagine. How very difficult for you, Miss Marple said with genuine sympathy. And yet you've managed to maintain this lovely cottage. I've taken in sewing, Mrs. Bingham said, though her eyes didn't quite meet Miss Marple's. And I've been very economical. One learns to manage on very little when necessary. Miss Marple gathered her knitting, preparing to leave. Well, my dear, I shan't take up more of your time. You've been most kind to indulge an old woman's curiosity. Oh, one small thing, that pretty beaded handbag you carried at the garden party. I meant to compliment you on it. Is it a family piece? Mrs. Bingham's hand flew to her throat. The handbag. I don't recall which one I carried that day. I have several. Why on earth would you ask about my handbag? No particular reason, Miss Marple said mildly, moving toward the door. Simply that I thought I saw you speaking with Mrs. Pemberton shortly before she collapsed, and you were carrying such a charming bag. I wondered if it might be available for purchase somewhere. My niece's birthday is approaching. I don't remember speaking with Martha, Mrs. Bingham said quickly. I'm quite certain I didn't. You must be mistaken. Perhaps I am, Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. My eyes aren't what they once were. Thank you for the tea, dear. Do take care of yourself. As she walked back toward the village centre, Miss Marple's expression was thoughtful. E. Bingham had lied about at least two things, speaking with Mrs. Pemberton before her death and her financial situation. The cottage was too well maintained, too comfortably furnished for someone living on sewing income alone. And pharmaceutical supplies from Switzerland could certainly include digitalis in its pure form. But the most revealing moment had been Mrs. Bingham's slip about feeling unappreciated by her husband, and the hard edge in her voice when speaking of Martha Pemberton's demanding nature. Most illuminating, Miss Marple murmured to herself. Most illuminating indeed. Miss Marple had barely returned home, and settled herself with a restorative cup of tea when her maid, faithful old Lucy, appeared in the doorway with an expression of alarm. Miss Marple, ma'am, young Dr. Haydock's boy has just come running. There's been another death, Mrs. Thornhill, ma'am, found this morning at her home. The doctor asks if you might come at once. The teacup clattered against the saucer. Miss Marple rose with a speed that belied her years, reaching for her hat and gloves. Tell the boy I'll come immediately. And Lucy, telephone Mrs. Bantry and ask her to meet me at Mrs. Thornhill's house as soon as possible. The scene at Linden House, Mrs. Thornhill's elegant residence on the edge of the village, was one of controlled chaos. Dr. Haydock met Miss Marple at the door, his face grave. I'm glad you've come, Miss Marple. Inspector Slack is on his way, and I thought, well, given your observations about Mrs. Pemberton's death, you might notice something that others would miss. How did she die? Miss Marple asked directly. At first appearance, it seems she took her own life. Sleeping draught, a considerable quantity. There's a note. He hesitated. It's a confession of sorts. She claims responsibility for embezzling from the fund, and implicates herself in Mrs. Pemberton's murder. Says she couldn't live with the guilt and that Mrs. Ashford was entirely innocent. How very convenient, Miss Marple murmured. Might I see the body and the note? Dr. Haydock led her upstairs to a handsomely appointed bedroom, where Mrs. Vera Thornhill lay on the bed in peaceful repose, as if merely sleeping. She was dressed in a silk nightgown and robe, her hair arranged on the pillow, her hands folded across her breast. On the bedside table sat an empty glass, a bottle of sleeping tablets, and a single sheet of notepaper covered in elegant handwriting. Miss Marple read the note carefully. I can no longer bear the weight of my crimes. I stole from the Widow's Benevolent Fund to maintain my lifestyle after my husband's death, left me with nothing but debts and shame. When Martha Pemberton discovered my theft, I poisoned her to protect myself. I allowed Cynthia Ashford to take the blame because I was too cowardly to face the consequences of my actions. I am a wicked woman who deserves no mercy. May God forgive me. Vera Thornhill. Most articulate for a suicide note, Miss Marple observed, setting the paper down carefully. Tell me, Doctor, when was she discovered and by whom? Her daily woman, Mrs. Price, found her this morning at 8 o'clock when she arrived to do the cleaning. Mrs. Thornhill was already cold. I'd estimate she died sometime between midnight and 4 in the morning. Was the door locked? No, which Mrs. Price found unusual. Mrs. Thornhill was meticulous about security, but perhaps, intending to take her own life, she felt such precautions no longer mattered. Miss Marple moved closer to the bed, studying the dead woman's face with the attention of a naturalist examining a specimen. Her expression is very peaceful. Sleeping draughts usually induce such a state, I understand. Yes, particularly in large doses. There would have been no struggle, no distress. And the handwriting on the note. You can confirm it's hers? I'm no expert, but it appears consistent with letters she sent me regarding medical matters. Inspector Slack will have it verified, of course. Miss Marple turned slowly, surveying the room, with those sharp eyes that missed nothing. The dressing table was orderly, brushes and cosmetics arranged with precision. The wardrobe door stood slightly ajar, revealing rows of expensive clothing. On the escritoire by the window sat a stack of correspondence, neatly sorted. She was a woman of method and order, Miss Marple commented. Everything in its place. That suggests a disciplined mind, not one prone to desperate acts. She paused by the escritoire, her fingers hovering over the letters. Might I? Dr. Haydock nodded his permission. Miss Marple examined the correspondence carefully. Bills, mostly, from dressmakers and milliners. A letter from a hotel in Brighton. Another from a solicitor regarding her late husband's estate. She picked up this last one, reading it with close attention. Dr. Haydock, this letter is dated 3 weeks ago. It states that the final settlement of Mr. Thornhill's estate has been completed, and that Mrs. Thornhill's portion amounts to nearly £8,000. After all debts were satisfied. That's a considerable sum. The doctor frowned, but the suicide note claims her husband left her with nothing but debts. Yes, it does rather, doesn't it? Miss Marple set the letter down. Most curious. A woman with £8,000 hardly needs to embezzle from a charity fund. And surely, if she had been stealing for 2 years, she would have begun before this settlement was finalized, yet the letter suggests the estate was only recently resolved. At that moment, heavy footsteps announced the arrival of Inspector Slack, who swept into the room with his customary lack of ceremony. Well, This simplifies matters considerably," he announced with satisfaction. "A clear confession, suicide, case closed. I'll have Mrs. Ashford released within the hour. A regrettable error, but these things happen in the course of investigation." "Do they?" Miss Marple inquired mildly. "How fortunate that Mrs. Thornhill chose to confess so thoroughly before taking her life. It saves you considerable paperwork, I imagine." Inspector Slack eyed her with suspicion. "I detect a note of skepticism, Miss Marple. I hope you're not going to complicate a straightforward situation with your usual fanciful theories." "I wouldn't dream of it, Inspector, though I do wonder, if Mrs. Thornhill intended to commit suicide, why would she leave her door unlocked? A woman who was, by all accounts, most particular about security." "Hardly relevant. People in such extremity don't think clearly. And yet her note is remarkably clear, quite methodical even." Miss Marple moved to the bedside table. "Tell me, Inspector, where was the bottle of sleeping tablets found?" "Right there on the table, as you can see." "Yes, but was it open or closed when Mrs. Price discovered the body?" Inspector Slack consulted his notebook with evident irritation. "Closed. The cap was on the bottle. How very tidy. One takes a fatal dose of medication and then carefully replaces the cap before lying down to die. Most considerate." Miss Marple's tone remained pleasant, but her eyes were hard. "And the glass, has it been examined? For what purpose? To determine if it contained only water, or perhaps some other substance that might have helped dissolve the tablets. Some people find it difficult to swallow large quantities of pills." Dr. Haydock interjected, "That's a valid point, Inspector. A fatal dose would require at least 20 tablets. That's quite a number to consume." Inspector Slack's face reddened. "Are you suggesting this wasn't suicide?" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple said gently, "that perhaps you should investigate more thoroughly before closing the case. Mrs. Thornhill had £8,000, no apparent financial difficulties, and was known to be meticulous about details. Her confession contradicts documentary evidence, and the circumstances of her death, while designed to appear as suicide, contain several elements that don't quite ring true. At the very least, shouldn't these matters be explored?" The inspector glowered but conceded grudgingly, "I'll have the glass analyzed. But I maintain this is suicide, and the case is effectively closed." As he stomped away to issue orders, Dr. Haydock murmured to Miss Marple, "You think she was murdered too?" "I think," Miss Marple replied quietly, "that someone is eliminating witnesses, and that someone is becoming increasingly desperate, and therefore increasingly dangerous." By afternoon, the village was in tumult. 2 deaths within a week, both connected to the Widow's Benevolent Fund, had transformed St. Mary Mead from a sleepy backwater into something resembling a Gothic novel. Miss Marple, observing the excitement from her cottage window, reflected that human nature was remarkably consistent. Tragedy brought out both the best and worst in people, often simultaneously. Mrs. Bantry arrived shortly after lunch, breathless and agitated. "Jane, have you heard? Inspector Slack is insisting Mrs. Thornhill's death was suicide, despite what you told him about the inconsistencies. He's already released Mrs. Ashford from custody. She's gone directly home and refuses to see anyone. Can you imagine the state she must be in?" "I can imagine it quite vividly," Miss Marple said, pouring tea. "Tell me, has anyone thought to check on Mrs. Bingham? She must be quite distraught. Her 2 fellow committee members dead within a week." Mrs. Bantry blinked. "Mrs. Bingham? I hadn't thought, but surely she's safe enough. I mean, If Mrs. Thornhill killed Martha and then herself, there's no more danger, is there?" Miss Marple's expression was troubled. "I'm not entirely convinced that Mrs. Thornhill killed anyone, dear. In fact, I rather suspect she was victim number 2 in what may prove to be a series." "A series?" Mrs. Bantry set down her cup with a clatter. "Jane, you're frightening me. Do you mean there might be more deaths?" "I sincerely hope not. But consider the pattern. 3 widows, all connected by a charitable fund, all present at a dinner party 6 months ago where a 4th person, Harold Bingham, died of sudden gastric distress. Now 2 of those widows are dead, supposedly one by murder and one by suicide. But I don't believe in such convenient coincidences. You think Harold Bingham was murdered too? I'm increasingly certain of it, and I believe the same person is responsible for all 3 deaths." Miss Marple leaned forward. "Think about it, dear. Mr. Bingham dies suddenly after a dinner party. 6 months later, Mrs. Pemberton, who was at that dinner, questions the fund accounts and is poisoned. Days afterward, Mrs. Thornhill, also at that dinner, is found dead with a confession that's contradicted by documentary evidence. What connects them all?" "The fund," Mrs. Bantry breathed, "and the dinner party. But that means—" She stopped, her eyes widening. "Mrs. Bingham! She was the hostess at that dinner, and she's the only committee member still alive." "Precisely." Miss Marple rose with decision. "I think we should pay Mrs. Bingham another visit, immediately." They found Church Lane Cottage quiet, almost too quiet. Miss Marple knocked several times before trying the door, which opened easily under her hand. "Mrs. Bingham," she called. "Are you at home? It's Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry." No answer came. The 2 women exchanged glances and stepped inside. The sitting room was just as Miss Marple had seen it that morning. Immaculate, orderly, undisturbed. But there was something different. Something that made the small hairs on the back of her neck stand at attention. A quality of emptiness that went beyond mere absence. "Perhaps she's gone out," Mrs. Bantry suggested nervously. "Perhaps," Miss Marple agreed, but she was already moving through the cottage with purpose. The kitchen was spotless, not even a teacup in the sink. The dining room showed no signs of recent use. Upstairs, the bedroom was neat as a pin, the bed made with military precision. But it was in the small study at the back of the house that Miss Marple found what she was looking for, or rather didn't find. The desk drawers stood open, their contents rifled through. Papers lay scattered across the floor. On the safe behind a small painting hung a jar, empty. "Someone's been here," Mrs. Bantry whispered, "searching for something." "Or removing evidence," Miss Marple corrected. She knelt, with some difficulty, to examine the papers on the floor. Bank statements, personal letters, household bills. And there, tucked beneath a water bill, a leather-bound ledger. Miss Marple opened it carefully. Column after column of figures marched across the pages in precise handwriting, dates, amounts, names. She recognized it immediately as the true accounts of the widow's benevolent fund. "Good heavens," she murmured, running her finger down the entries. "This is quite extraordinary." Mrs. Bantry peered over her shoulder. "What am I looking at?" "Evidence," Miss Marple said grimly. "Our evidence that someone has been systematically embezzling from the fund for more than 2 years. But not Mrs. Ashford, as the forged records suggested, and not Mrs. Thornhill, as the suicide note claimed. Look here. These withdrawals, always in small amounts to avoid detection, always made by someone with signing authority. And see these notations in the margin? Initials, E.B. Eleanor Bingham," Mrs. Bantry breathed. But she seemed so helpless, so ineffectual. Yes, she did rather, didn't she? An excellent disguise for someone planning murder. Miss Marple closed the ledger carefully. I believe Mrs. Pemberton discovered this ledger, or one like it, and threatened to expose Mrs. Bingham. So Mrs. Bingham poisoned her, using digitalis obtained through her late husband's pharmaceutical business. Then she forged evidence to implicate Mrs. Ashford, knowing that an embezzlement charge combined with motive would be enough for Inspector Slack to make an arrest. But why kill Mrs. Thornhill? Because Mrs. Thornhill also knew something, or Mrs. Bingham feared she did. Perhaps she witnessed something at the garden party, or perhaps she'd begun asking questions about the accounts. So Mrs. Bingham drugged her, again easy enough with access to pharmaceutical supplies, staged a suicide, and wrote a confession that would clear Mrs. Ashford and close the case permanently. But where is she now? Mrs. Bantry looked around nervously. If she knows you've been asking questions. The thought hung unfinished in the air, heavy with implication. Miss Marple moved quickly to the window, peering out at the quiet lane. She's fled, she said with certainty, probably this morning, after she realized I'd begun connecting the pieces. The question is, where would she go? They returned downstairs, and Miss Marple made directly for the telephone, dialing with steady fingers. Dr. Haydock, Miss Marple here. I need you to tell me something quite urgently. That dinner party at the Binghams 6 months ago, you said several guests complained of mild stomach upset. Who specifically? I see. And did Eleanor Bingham suffer any symptoms herself? She didn't. How very interesting. Thank you, Doctor. She replaced the receiver and turned to Mrs. Bantry with grim satisfaction. Everyone at that dinner party fell ill except Eleanor Bingham, and one other guest who barely touched the food, Martha Pemberton, who was on one of her reducing diets. Harold Bingham received the fatal dose, while the others received just enough to make the poisoning look like food contamination rather than murder. She killed her own husband, Mrs. Bantry gasped. For insurance money, I suspect, and to free herself from what she described to me as an unappreciative and demanding marriage. Then she joined the Widows' Fund, gained access to its accounts, and began stealing, small amounts at first, growing bolder over time. When Martha Pemberton grew suspicious, Mrs. Bingham eliminated her. When Mrs. Thornhill became a liability, she eliminated her too. Now she's disappeared, taking with her whatever money she could lay hands on. Miss Marple moved toward the door with surprising speed. Come, we must inform Inspector Slack immediately. Mrs. Bingham has several hours head start, but she can't have gotten far, not if we act quickly. As they hurried down Church Lane toward the police station, Miss Marple's mind was already racing ahead, calculating possibilities and probabilities. Eleanor Bingham had proven herself a clever and ruthless killer. The question now was whether she could be caught before she disappeared entirely, or worse, before she claimed another victim to cover her tracks. Inspector Slack's reaction to Miss Marple's discoveries was precisely as predictable as she had anticipated. Bluster, skepticism, and finally grudging acknowledgement when confronted with the ledger and its damning evidence. This doesn't prove murder, he insisted, though his conviction had noticeably weakened. Mrs. Bingham may have embezzled, yes, but these theories about poisoning her husband and the others, where's your proof? The proof, Miss Marple said with uncharacteristic sharpness, is in the pattern, Inspector. 3 deaths, all connected to one woman, all conveniently removing people who threatened her security. Harold Bingham knew his business was failing, and may have discovered his wife was stealing from him. Martha Pemberton discovered the embezzlement from the fund. Vera Thornhill, well, I haven't yet determined what she knew, but something frightened Mrs. Bingham enough to silence her permanently. Speculation, Slack muttered, but he was already reaching for the telephone. I'll put out a bulletin. All stations between here and London, and the ports. If she's trying to flee the country, we'll catch her. I wonder, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, if she is trying to flee, or if she has something else in mind. Both Slack and Mrs. Bantry stared at her. What do you mean? The inspector demanded. Mrs. Bingham is clever, Inspector. Clever enough to have committed 3 murders. 4, if we count her husband, without arousing immediate suspicion. Clever enough to frame first Mrs. Ashford and then Mrs. Thornhill for her crimes. Would such a person simply run away, or would she attempt to complete her plan? What plan? Miss Marple's expression was grave. Consider her position. She's stolen a substantial sum from the fund, but it's not enough to live comfortably for long. The embezzlement will be discovered now that we have the true ledger. She can't access the remaining fund money without arousing suspicion. But there is one source of wealth still available to her. Mrs. Bantry gasped. Mrs. Ashford. She's just been released from custody. She's alone in that big house, and everyone knows she's wealthy. Precisely. Mrs. Bingham has successfully eliminated 2 committee members and framed a 3rd. If Mrs. Ashford were to die now, apparently by suicide, overcome by guilt despite her release, who would inherit the fund's remaining assets? The sole surviving trustee, Eleanor Bingham, of course. Inspector Slack was already on his feet. We need to get to Mrs. Ashford's house immediately. Wait, Miss Marple said quietly, her hand on his arm. If we simply rush there, Mrs. Bingham will flee, if she's even there at all. We need to catch her in the act with evidence that cannot be disputed. Otherwise, she'll claim innocence, insist someone else killed Mrs. Thornhill. Ian will have nothing but circumstantial evidence and an elderly woman's theories. What are you suggesting? A trap, Inspector. But it requires Mrs. Ashford's cooperation, and it requires us to act as though we suspect nothing. Miss Marple's eyes were bright with the intensity of thought. Mrs. Bingham is methodical. She plans carefully. She won't strike until she's certain of success. That gives us a small window of opportunity. 20 minutes later, they were gathered in Mrs. Ashford's imposing drawing room. Miss Marple, Mrs. Bantry, Inspector Slack, Dr. Haydock, and Mrs. Ashford herself, who sat ramrod straight in her chair, her face still bearing the marks of her recent ordeal. You're telling me, she said in her clipped authoritative voice, that Eleanor Bingham murdered 3 people, framed me for murder and embezzlement, and is now planning to kill me as well? I'm afraid so, Miss Marple confirmed, though I cannot prove it without your assistance. Then you shall have it. Mrs. Ashford's jaw set with determination. That timid little mouse fooled us all. Well, she won't fool me again. What do you need me to do? Miss Marple outlined her plan with the precision of a general deploying troops. Mrs. Ashford would send a note to Mrs. Bingham, delivered to the cottage, but also to several other locations where she might be staying, expressing her distress and asking for company this evening. She would mention that she was alone, that her servants had been given the evening off to visit family, and that she desperately needed a friend. The note must suggest vulnerability, Miss Marple explained. Mrs. Bingham must believe you're broken by the arrest, perhaps even contemplating taking your own life. She'll come, I'm certain of it. It's too perfect an opportunity for her to resist. And when she comes, we'll be waiting. Inspector Slack and Constable Polk will be concealed in the library. Dr. Haydock and I will be in the morning room, able to observe through the connecting door. Mrs. Bantry will remain at my cottage. I won't risk more people than necessary. Mrs. Ashford, you must engage her in conversation. Try to get her to reveal something incriminating. If she attempts to poison you, we'll intervene immediately." Mrs. Ashford's smile was grim. "I've faced down striking workers and incompetent executives, Miss Marple. I can certainly handle one murderous embezzler." The note was dispatched by hand to 3 locations: Church Lane Cottage, the Royal Arms Hotel in the village, and the station, in case Mrs. Bingham was planning to leave by train. Then they settled in to wait. Evening fell slowly over St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple took up her position in the morning room, her knitting in her lap but her eyes fixed on the drawing room through the carefully positioned door. Dr. Haydock sat beside her, tense and watchful. In the library, Inspector Slack and the constable waited in darkness. Mrs. Ashford sat in her drawing room, the picture of desolation, a tea service arranged before her. 7 o'clock came and went, then 8. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, but her mind was racing. Had she miscalculated? Had Mrs. Bingham somehow sensed the trap? At 8:30, the doorbell rang. Mrs. Ashford rose, moving slowly as if weighed down by despair, and opened the door herself. On the threshold stood Eleanor Bingham, her face arranged in an expression of sympathetic concern, carrying a small wicker basket. "Cynthia, my dear," she said, her voice tremulous with what seemed like genuine emotion. "I came as soon as I received your note. You poor thing, what you've been through. I've brought some soup and a sleeping draught from Dr. Haydock's prescription. You must eat something and try to rest." Miss Marple's needles paused. A sleeping draught. How very predictable. Mrs. Ashford ushered Mrs. Bingham inside, her performance of gratitude entirely convincing. "Eleanor, how kind! I confess, I've thought of ending it all. The shame, the humiliation, even though I have been released, everyone will always wonder if I was truly guilty." "Nonsense," Mrs. Bingham soothed, setting down her basket and beginning to unpack it with practiced efficiency. "You must put such thoughts from your mind. Here, let me pour you some of this soup. It's my special recipe, very restorative. And then you'll take the sleeping draught and get a proper night's rest. Everything will look better in the morning." Through the crack in the door, Miss Marple watched as Mrs. Bingham prepared the soup with careful attention, her back turned to Mrs. Ashford. Her hand moved to her pocket, withdrew something small, and made a subtle motion over the bowl. "Now then," Mrs. Bingham said, turning with a bright smile that didn't reach her eyes, "drink this while it's hot, and then we'll get you upstairs to bed." Miss Marple rose silently, Dr. Haydock beside her. In the library, Inspector Slack was already moving. Mrs. Ashford took the bowl, raised it to her lips, and then, with perfect timing, the door burst open, and Inspector Slack strode into the room. "Mrs. Eleanor Bingham, I'm arresting you for the murders of Martha Pemberton and Vera Thornhill, and on suspicion of the murder of Harold Bingham." Mrs. Bingham's transformation was instantaneous and remarkable. The timid, tremulous widow vanished as if she had never existed, replaced by a woman whose eyes held a cold, calculating intelligence that sent a chill through the room. "Don't be absurd," she said, her voice stripped of its usual wavering quality. "I've brought soup to comfort a friend. There's no crime in that." "Indeed not," Miss Marple said, stepping into the drawing room with Dr. Haydock behind her. "Unless, of course, that soup contains a fatal dose of barbiturates. Dr. Haydock, if you would be so kind as to test the contents." The doctor took the bowl from Mrs. Ashford's hands and produced a small testing kit from his pocket. The silence in the room was absolute as he added reagents and observed the results. "Positive," he said grimly. "A substantial quantity of secobarbital, enough to kill within hours. The same substance found in Mrs. Thornhill's system." Mrs. Bingham's composure cracked slightly, but she rallied quickly. "Someone must have tampered with my basket. I had no idea. Please don't insult our intelligence," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "I've been observing you carefully, Mrs. Bingham, and I've come to understand you rather well. You're a woman of considerable intelligence and determination, who found herself trapped in circumstances you considered beneath you. But your husband was a failure whose business was collapsing, leaving you facing poverty and obscurity. So you poisoned him." "That's a lie. Harold died of food poisoning. He died of arsenic poisoning, I suspect," Miss Marple continued in that same gentle, implacable tone. "Administered during the dinner party you hosted so carefully. You gave small doses to the other guests to disguise the murder as contaminated food, but your husband received the fatal quantity. Dr. Haydock, I believe if you were to exhume Mr. Bingham's body, you would find traces of arsenic in his remains even after 6 months." Dr. Haydock nodded slowly. "Arsenic accumulates in hair and nails. If Miss Marple is correct, we would indeed find evidence. You had access to arsenic through your husband's pharmaceutical business," Miss Marple went on. Just as you had access to digitalis and barbiturates. You're not the helpless widow you pretended to be. You managed your husband's accounts, understood his business, and knew exactly where to obtain the poisons you needed." Mrs. Bingham said nothing, but her hands had clenched into fists. "After your husband's death, you joined the Widow's Benevolent Fund, partly to appear respectable, but primarily to gain access to its finances. You began embezzling almost immediately, small amounts at first, then larger sums as your confidence grew. You were clever about it, spreading the thefts over time, manipulating the records. But Martha Pemberton was also clever, and she had an accountant's eye for numbers. She noticed the discrepancies. "Martha was a meddling fool," Mrs. Bingham said suddenly, and the venom in her voice was startling. Always interfering, always questioning, always insisting everything be done properly. She couldn't simply let things be." "So you killed her," Miss Marple said quietly. "At the garden party, when you approached her table with that beaded handbag of yours. You distracted her. Perhaps you pointed out something in the garden or dropped something. And while her attention was diverted, you added digitalis to her tea. It was a risky moment, but you're a woman who understands that fortune favors the bold." Mrs. Bingham's face had gone very still, very white. "Then you planted forged evidence to implicate Mrs. Ashford. You had access to the fund accounts and could manipulate them to show whatever you wished. You knew Inspector Slack's tendency towards simple solutions. Give him a clear suspect with obvious motive, and he'd arrest first and investigate later. Mrs. Ashford would be convicted, and the embezzlement would be blamed on her. But Mrs. Thornhill became a problem," Dr. Haydock interjected, understanding dawning. "She knew something. She knew the real financial records," Miss Marple confirmed. "As treasurer, she had copies of all transactions. I suspect she confronted Mrs. Bingham privately, perhaps intending to blackmail her, or perhaps simply confused about the discrepancies. Either way, she was too dangerous to leave alive. So you visited her that night, Mrs. Bingham. You brought wine or tea, something friendly, something that wouldn't arouse suspicion between committee members. You drugged her with barbiturates until she was unconscious, then forced more tablets down her throat. You arranged the scene carefully. who wrote that convenient confession in handwriting you'd practiced copying and left her to be found. You can't prove any of this." Mrs. Bingham's voice rose sharply. "It's all speculation, the fantasies of a senile old woman. Can't I?" Miss Marple's smile was sad. "Inspector Slack, in Mrs. Bingham's cottage, you'll find a concealed compartment in her escritoire. Second drawer on the left, false bottom. In it, you'll discover pharmaceutical supplies including digitalis, arsenic, and barbiturates, along with the actual financial records of the fund showing systematic theft. You'll also find approximately £3,000 in cash, money stolen from the fund that she was preparing to take with her when she fled." Inspector Slack gestured to Constable Polk. "Go check it, now. But the real proof," Miss Marple continued, "is in your basket, you Mrs. Bingham. You brought it with you tonight, intending to murder Mrs. Ashford. Dr. Haydock has just confirmed that the soup contained fatal quantities of barbiturates. There's no possible innocent explanation for that. You came here tonight to kill, just as you killed Martha Pemberton and Vera Thornhill and your own husband." The silence that followed was profound. Mrs. Bingham stood frozen, her face a mask of fury and calculation. Then, quite suddenly, she collapsed into a chair, and the timid widow reappeared. But this time, it was grotesquely hollow, a performance everyone could see through. "You don't understand," she whispered. "Harold was going to divorce me. After 20 years of service, of managing his failing business, of enduring his criticism and demands, he was going to cast me aside for a younger woman with no skills but a pretty face. I would have been left with nothing. "So you killed him," Miss Marple said, not without sympathy. "And having killed once, it became easier each time. Martha threatened your security, so she had to die. Vera could expose you, so she had to die. And tonight, Cynthia stood between you and complete control of the fund's remaining assets." Mrs. Bingham's laugh was bitter. "You make it sound so cold. But you've never been discarded like refuse, Miss Marple. You've never faced poverty after a lifetime of respectability. I did what I had to do to survive." "You murdered 4 people," Mrs. Ashford said, her voice hard as stone. "Don't dress it up as survival. You're a killer who valued money more than human life." Constable Polk returned at that moment, carrying a small lockbox. "Found it exactly where Miss Marple said, Inspector. Everything's here. The drugs, the money, ledgers with the real accounts." Inspector Slack moved forward, producing handcuffs with grim satisfaction. "Eleanor Bingham, you are under arrest for murder. You are not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say may be taken down and used in evidence." As the inspector led Mrs. Bingham away, the woman who had fooled them all with her performance of timid helplessness, Miss Marple sank into a chair with a deep sigh. "Are you quite well, Miss Marple?" Dr. Haydock asked with concern. "Quite well, doctor. Simply tired. It's exhausting, you know, observing people so closely. One sees such darkness in the human heart." She looked up at Mrs. Ashford, who still stood rigid with shock and anger. "I'm sorry we had to use you as bait, my dear, but it was the only way to catch her with indisputable evidence." Mrs. Ashford's expression softened slightly. "You saved my life, Miss Marple. I can hardly complain about the method. That soup would have killed me, wouldn't it, Doctor?" "Within 6 hours," Dr. Haydock confirmed. "And it would have looked exactly like suicide. A woman overcome by guilt despite her release, taking her own life. Mrs. Bingham would have been the grieving friend who found the body, and the last witness to her crimes would have been silenced. Mrs. Bantry, who had been summoned once the arrest was made, arrived breathless and wide-eyed. "Is it true? Was it really Mrs. Bingham all along?" "Really and truly," Miss Marple confirmed. "The timid widow was entirely a fiction, quite her best performance, I must say. She nearly fooled me completely." "But you suspected her?" "I began to suspect when I noticed certain inconsistencies. Her cottage was too well maintained for someone living on sewing income. Her knowledge of her husband's business seemed far more extensive than she admitted. And most tellingly, she lied about speaking to Martha Pemberton at the garden party. Why lie about such a trivial thing unless it was actually quite significant? That started me thinking about opportunity and access." "And the beaded handbag?" Mrs. Bantry asked. "Ah, yes, the handbag. Small enough to seem innocent, large enough to carry a vial of poison." She approached Mrs. Pemberton's table, distracted her somehow, as she added digitalis to the tea, and withdrew. No one would have noticed, just two acquaintances having a brief conversation. But Mrs. Bingham made a mistake. She became flustered when I mentioned the handbag. An innocent person would have simply described it or offered to show it to me. Her defensive reaction told me it was significant. Mrs. Ashford had regained some of her usual composure. "I owe you my life, Miss Marple. If there's anything, there is one thing," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "The Widow's Benevolent Fund should continue, properly managed this time. There are genuinely needy widows who deserve assistance, women who aren't murderers and embezzlers. Perhaps you might consider reforming the committee with proper financial oversight." "Consider it done," Mrs. Ashford said firmly, "though I confess I'll be more careful about whom I trust in future." "A wise precaution," Miss Marple agreed, "though perhaps not too careful. Most people, I find, are simply ordinary humans muddling through life as best they can. It's only occasionally that one encounters someone like Eleanor Bingham, who decided that her comfort was worth more than others' lives." As the small group dispersed into the night, Miss Marple remained for a moment in Mrs. Ashford's drawing room, her knitting finally put away, her mind reflecting on the case. 3 widows, 3 weeks, 3 deaths, or rather 4, if one counted Harold Bingham. All of it orchestrated by a woman who had learned to weaponize the very qualities that society expected of widows: timidity, helplessness, emotional fragility. It had been, she thought, as she finally allowed Mrs. Bantry to escort her home, a most instructive case. And a reminder that the most dangerous people were often those who appeared most harmless. A lesson she'd learned many times over the years, and one that St. Mary Mead would not soon forget. The village would talk about this for months, she knew, perhaps years. But life would return to normal, as it always did. Gardens would be tended, tea would be served, and beneath the surface of ordinary respectability, human nature would continue its eternal dance of virtue and vice, kindness and cruelty, truth and deception. And she would be there, watching it all with those sharp, knowing eyes, ready, if needed, to unravel the next mystery that disturbed the peace of her beloved St. Mary Mead. 3 weeks had passed since Eleanor Bingham's arrest, and St. Mary Mead had begun the slow process of returning to what passed for normalcy, in a village that had just witnessed 4 murders. The autumn had arrived with its usual persistence, painting the gardens in shades of amber and gold, and life continued its eternal rhythm despite the darkness that had momentarily disrupted it. Miss Marple sat in her garden on a particularly fine October afternoon, her knitting in her lap, watching the late roses bloom with their final burst of colour before winter. Mrs. Bantry had come to tea, as she did most Thursdays, and the two friends sat in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. "I saw in the newspaper that Mrs. Bingham's trial date has been set," Mrs. Bantry said finally, breaking the quiet. "January. They say it will be quite the sensation. 4 murders, all carefully planned. And the newspapers are calling her the Black Widow of St. Mary Mead." Miss Marple made a small sound of distaste. How sensational do they make it all sound? As if Eleanor Bingham were some sort of monster, rather than simply a woman who made terrible choices when faced with circumstances she couldn't bear. Surely you're not sympathizing with her, Jane, after everything she did. Not sympathizing, no. Understanding, perhaps, which is rather different. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. She was a woman of intelligence, trapped in a society that offered her few options. When her husband threatened to discard her, she saw only poverty and humiliation ahead. So she killed him, and having crossed that line once, found it easier to cross again. And again, it's a pattern I've observed before. The first murder is the hardest. The rest become merely practical solutions to practical problems. That's rather chilling. Yes, dear, human nature so often is. Miss Marple paused to adjust her wool. The tragedy is that she had options she refused to see. Her husband's estate settlement left her comfortably situated. She could have lived modestly but respectably. Instead, she chose to steal from widows who had far less than she did and to murder anyone who threatened to expose her crimes. Pride and greed, the oldest sins in the world. Mrs. Bantry sipped her tea thoughtfully. Mrs. Ashford has been rather changed by the whole affair. She's reformed the Widows' Benevolent Fund with an entirely new committee and brought in an independent accountant to oversee the finances. And she's been considerably more gracious to people. I actually saw her smile at the grocer's yesterday. A genuine smile, not that tight-lipped grimace she usually manages. Nearly being murdered does tend to provide perspective, Miss Marple observed mildly. I'm glad to hear it. Cynthia Ashford is a good woman beneath that stern exterior. She simply never learned to show warmth. Perhaps this experience will teach her something about vulnerability and human connection. She's established a memorial fund in Martha Pemberton's name, for genuine charitable work, she says, to honour Martha's intentions. And she's personally apologised to everyone in the village for, as she put it, allowing such corruption to occur under her watch. Rather handsome of her, I thought. Very handsome indeed. Miss Marple set down her knitting to pour more tea. Oh, and what of the others? How is the village managing the aftermath? Well, the Mrs. Skinner are in their element, of course. They've never had such interesting news to dispense. Colonel Weatherby claims he suspected Mrs. Bingham all along, which is absolute nonsense, but no one contradicts him. Dr. Haydock has been rather quiet. I think he blames himself for not recognizing Harold Bingham's poisoning at the time. He mustn't, Miss Marple said firmly. He had no reason to suspect murder, and Eleanor Bingham was extraordinarily careful. She studied her husband's pharmaceutical business, learned exactly which poisons to use and how to disguise them, and planned each death with meticulous attention to detail. She very nearly succeeded completely. Thanks to you, she didn't. Miss Marple shook her head gently. Thanks to her own overconfidence, really. She thought herself so clever, so invulnerable, that she became careless. The forged suicide note that contradicted documentary evidence, the unlocked door, the carefully replaced medicine bottle cap, small details that didn't quite fit. If she'd been content with 2 murders, she might have escaped entirely. But she became greedy. wanted to eliminate Mrs. Ashford and claim the remaining fund assets. Greed and pride, they always lead to mistakes. A robin landed on the garden wall, regarding them with bright, curious eyes before flying away into the gathering dusk. Miss Marple watched it go with a small smile. "You know what troubles me most?" Mrs. Bantry said after a moment. "How completely she fooled us all. That timid, apologetic manner, the trembling hands, is the constant anxiety. All of it was performance. We saw exactly what she wanted us to see." "Yes, and that's perhaps the most important lesson," Miss Marple agreed. "People very seldom are what they appear on the surface. The timid may be calculating, the confident may be frightened, the respectable may harbour terrible secrets. I've learned over the years that one must look beneath the performance to the person underneath. And one must pay attention to the small inconsistencies, the cottage too well maintained, the lie about a trivial conversation, the defensive reaction to an innocent question. Those little cracks in the facade tell the truth that the performance tries to hide. It makes one rather paranoid, doesn't it? Wondering what secrets everyone is hiding. Not at all, dear. Most people are exactly what they seem. Ordinary souls trying to live their lives with as much dignity and happiness as they can manage. It's only occasionally that one encounters someone like Eleanor Bingham, and even she wasn't born a murderer. She was made one by choices, circumstances, and a fundamental selfishness that valued her own comfort above other people's lives." The vicar appeared at the garden gate, his gentle face apologetic. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Bantry, forgive the intrusion. I wanted to thank you both, particularly you, Miss Marple, for everything you did. The whole village is in your debt." "Nonsense, vicar," Miss Marple said briskly. "I simply observed what was there to be seen. Inspector Slack deserves the credit for the arrest." The vicar's smile was knowing. "Inspector Slack arrested the wrong person entirely until you pointed out his error. Let's not be falsely modest. You saved Mrs. Ashford's life and brought a murderer to justice. That deserves recognition." "What it deserves," Miss Marple said firmly, "is to be forgotten as quickly as possible so that this village can heal. Recognition and gratitude are all very well, but they keep the wounds fresh. Better to let the whole sorry business fade into the past where it belongs." After the vicar departed, the two friends sat in silence as the shadows lengthened across the garden. The church bells rang for evensong, their notes clear and pure in the autumn air. "Life goes on," Mrs. Bantry murmured. "Despite everything, life simply goes on." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed softly. "That's the remarkable thing about human resilience. We endure tragedies, survive betrayals, witness horrors, and yet we continue. We tend our gardens, drink our tea, gossip with our neighbours, and find small moments of joy in the everyday routine. It's rather magnificent, really, when one considers it. Will you miss it? The investigation, I mean, the puzzle solving." Miss Marple considered the question carefully. "I don't seek out murder, dear. I'm quite content with my roses and my knitting and my quiet life. But when darkness intrudes, when someone uses their intelligence and cunning to harm others, yes, I confess I feel compelled to act. Justice matters, truth matters, and sometimes an observant old woman with time on her hands and a lifetime of experience watching human nature can see things that others miss. The village is fortunate to have you." "The village," Miss Marple said with a gentle smile, "has me whether it wants me or not. I'm rather like the ivy on the church wall, overlooked most of the time, but surprisingly tenacious when needed." As Mrs. Bantry took her leave and Miss Marple gathered her knitting to go inside, she paused for a moment to look at her beloved village. Lights were beginning to glow in cottage windows. Smoke rose from chimneys. Somewhere, a dog barked and a child laughed. St. Mary Mead was healing, returning to itself, the recent darkness fading into memory. But Miss Marple knew, as she had always known, that beneath the peaceful surface, human nature continued its eternal dance of light and shadow. There would be other secrets, other lies, perhaps even other crimes. And she would be here, watching with those sharp, knowing eyes, ready to unravel whatever mysteries the future might bring. For now, though, there was tea to finish, a fire to tend, and the evening newspaper to read. The ordinary pleasures of an ordinary life in an ordinary village, which was, after all, exactly as it should be. She went inside as the last light faded from the sky, leaving the garden to darkness and the quiet rustle of autumn leaves. Behind her, St. Mary Mead settled into night, peaceful and unremarkable, keeping its secrets and nursing its scars, while the world turned on and human nature remained forever complicated, forever surprising, and forever worth observing. And Miss Jane Marple, knitting in her chair by the fire, smiled to herself and thought that perhaps that was wisdom enough for one lifetime.